Hello and welcome to another episode of Geostrategy in Action. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm Famke, I lead the Geostrategy team in Europe, and I'm joined by Falco today, who leads our restructuring practice globally. What we want to do today is talk really about geostrategy in action, in practice, like the title says. So very concretely, what can companies actually do in order to better navigate the current geopolitical environment? I mean, I think it's pretty clear. Geopolitical developments every week continue to confirm a broader trend that we've been seeing for years, which is that we're moving towards more uncertainty, more change, and the outcomes, including for businesses, continue to be defined by geopolitics. So we've just done an updated scenario analysis on the future of globalization. And here, and without going into too much detail, it's public, you can have a read. It's going to be complicated as the conclusion of that analysis as well. We essentially expect different scenarios to be true depending on what sector you're in, depending on what parts of the world you're in. So it's not getting easier at all, meaning that from a business perspective, you are navigating and will continue to be navigating complexity and uncertainty. And so clearly, one of the main takeaways from this is that businesses, you need to be in a better position to manage this world. So, Falco, if I can bring you in, I'm sure with the job that you do, you have seen a lot of businesses in crisis, and you've seen a fair bit about what it can mean very concretely if this is also triggered by the geopolitical environment. What are some of the main observations? What have you seen over the past couple of months or years in this space?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. Interesting topic, and thanks for being part of the conversation. I think the biggest change that we've observed over the last 2-3 years is that geopolitics have become a managerial reality. You cannot develop strategic concepts or performance concepts or restructuring visions without having a geopolitical angle. You have to check to what extent the geopolitical challenges, as ever-changing as they may be, to what extent they affect your value chain or your value system. And this has become a reality that needs to be factored into every piece of work that we do, but also into the everyday management reality of leadership teams.
So, Falco, when you work with businesses, do you get a feeling that they feel comfortable navigating this environment and that they're well positioned to understand what is actually going on and how they're impacted by this and what they can be doing about this? I mean, I think I know the answer, but I'm very curious to hear what you think about this.
There's a suggestive twist to your question, and of course not. I mean, this is a reasonably new situation. For a number of years, the leadership teams that are in situ at the moment have been operating in a world in which the economic system was pretty much disjunct from the political and geopolitical reality. Politics were providing a platform on which companies have been doing what they do best: growing, being efficient, delivering profits. Now this has changed pretty drastically, and the degree to which companies are ready for that varies, of course. And being ready happens on various layers. There's what I would call a geopolitical monitoring or a geopolitical savviness to understand to what extent this affects your business. So already on that level, there's varying degrees of fitness, I would say. Then you have a next layer, which I would relate to being resilient, having the cost structures you can afford, being as asset light as you can possibly be, managing your working capital smartly, all of those good things, having an eye on data security, system security, and all of these elements. So this is the next layer. And clearly, not all companies are reacting to that already. And then there's a third layer, which is probably the most challenging one because it appears quite scenario dependent. It's your vision vis-a-vis internationalization going forward. If we assume that the days are gone in which we could set up transnational value systems pretty freely and just assuming that if we all do business with each other, we also deal with each other in a peaceful manner. If we assume that, which I think is a fair assumption, although simplified, then companies need to develop a new vision of their international presence. And that is probably the most challenging one because they can easily say, well, I don't have the clarity that's necessary to do that. The context is changing every day, so I will wait until I have the necessary clarity, which is a big risk because time and resources are being lost while the big question is being externalized.
And these days, I feel like if you wait for this current situation or the uncertainty to calm down or to even maybe go away, you might be waiting for a really long time. So it's just not something that's possible anymore. I get the feeling that more and more businesses now start to understand this because they feel it. They've been waiting for a long time now, and it just doesn't work anymore. You pointed to something in the very beginning that I personally find very interesting, which is this human component, this idea that we all need to realize and acknowledge that who sits in the boardrooms and in the C-suites of all of these businesses is a generation of people that have grown up in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, where we saw advancing globalization. This was the end of the Cold War, and really businesses could focus especially their international expansion, purely on economic assumption because the politics was enabling, if anything, in a majority of cases, and of course simplified. And that has changed. So I think there's a really big, important component here to just realize it is structural change going into a direction that a majority of these people have not seen in their professional careers. And so I think once that is something that we acknowledge, we can move forward much better. And yeah, as you alluded to, this is not really crisis management mode anymore. It's not sufficient because it's a permanent crisis from that perspective. So what can be done in a more structural way to address this much better? So I don't know if you have any suggestions in practice what can be done to move away from this crisis management mode to a more proactive management of this geopolitical environment that we're describing.
Yeah, I would start with what you mentioned last, developing a different attitude towards crisis. I think we need to demystify crisis a little bit, and we need to understand that we are managing companies, we are leading companies in a period in which adaptation is a pretty constant state. And even adaptation to drastic changes, disruptive changes, it would be wrong, it would be time consuming and also resource consuming to think that we will deal with the crisis and then things will swing back to normal. I think that's an illusion, certainly midterm. So that's one. When it comes to these paradigmatic changes that you've alluded to so rightfully, as the old quote says, culture has strategy for breakfast. So if we want companies to be fitter in this environment, they need to break a few paradigms. And you've alluded to that. And this is challenging, right? Because the let's say the normative framework, the set of objectives that companies are operating under is changing. That's for once. That is so there is societal elements, social elements, environmental elements that are kicking in on top of the financial objectives, plus the fact that short-term financial objectives are complemented more and more by longer-term value orientation. So that's happening anyways. There was a very full transformative agenda already. Then we had this big experience of vulnerability that happened during COVID. And then, unfortunately, the invasion of Ukraine and other developments have really very fiercely brought the geopolitical dimension to the attention of boredom. So it's a lot that is piling up, and it is challenging to change the management and leadership paradigm, but that needs to happen. It needs to happen factually. I've alluded to the various layers of possible actions, but it also needs to happen culturally.
Yeah, I completely agree, and we also speak a lot with our clients around, and more, to be honest, about this idea of the need for an internal political culture, but in the sense of there needs to be in the different parts of the business an understanding of the politics and the geopolitics, because it needs to be considered. This external environment needs to be considered in a majority of the decisions that are being taken, whether it's on investments, on broader strategy, on crisis management or risk management decisions. And a lot of businesses are actually not in a situation where they currently have often anybody, and certainly not multiple people, that are actually in a capacity to not just understand the external environment, which is also what you alluded to earlier, this monitoring, etc., but then also being able to translate this into what could this actually mean for us as a business, or for me as the risk manager, the supply chain manager, etc. And so that is something that is fundamental change. And we also start to get more and more questions around this. How can we actually implement internally a governance around better geopolitical risk management? Because we want to move from this constant crisis management. We have an ad hoc committee that deals with it, which now exists for 2 or 3 years. It is not so ad hoc anymore. How can we move from that to actually having a governance that makes sense in this environment?
And then how can we make the switch from being reactive to being proactive? The big danger in this context is that companies drift into a permanent reaction mode. As the changes are happening so frequently and sometimes in such a disruptive manner, this pushes you into a corner in which strategic thinking, developing a vision of the company in the future, becomes almost impossible. And this reaction mode is really one of the biggest dangers at the moment. And it can happen very easily because you externalize the question. You basically say, well, I don't have the clarity. Things are changing, as I've said before. And very quickly you find yourself in this reactive corner. Now, one can argue that if you become proactive, you still have to deal with this ever-changing environment. Correct. But you do this through a completely different lens. Yeah. If you, for example, say, just hypothetically, I'm a consumer goods company. I cannot be very selective in my choice of markets. I have to deal with the uncertainty. I have to deal with the tariffs. I have to deal with the supply chain challenges. But my vision is to pretty much continue to be wherever I can be in terms of markets. Then this is an orientation, and you see everything through that lens. If, on the other hand, you're, I don't know, a mid-cap defense player that all of a sudden has become super popular after decades of being a little bit on the fringes, and you want to operate along an axis of quote-unquote friendly markets, you necessarily are much more selective in your internationalization strategy, and you see things through that lens. So I think this switch from being reactive to being proactive, that's particularly important.
Yeah, that's right. And also what you say makes me think it is, of course, also particularly difficult, not just to make proactive decisions, but to make bold decisions in this environment if you're not used to that and if you feel like you don't really understand it. And it is actually this environment that might require businesses to make bolder decisions and decisions that are very different from what they have done in the past. So that also points towards the necessity, one, to get comfortable with the uncertainty, and then to also understand that there's many ways that you can manage. It's one of my positive news that I try and get across in this world that is where it's not always very easy to talk positive when you talk about geopolitical risk analysis, but it is something that businesses can actually manage. They can do much more than I think many businesses realize, and fully acknowledging that this environment is very, very complex to navigate. But when I see both in the numbers that we have, what we get from surveys, but also what I hear in everyday conversations with businesses, I'm very confident that there's so much more that they can do to actually advance and understand the environment better, be much more strategic and rigorous in translating it, what it means for the business, integrating it into their strategy decisions, etc. All the things that you already mentioned. So, I mean, if I can ask you maybe a final question, because we've mentioned many things that businesses can or should be doing. If a business executive could just do one thing right now, what do you recommend that it would be? Where would you start if this is not something that you're used to dealing with in your business?
In very simple terms, embrace geopolitics as a reality and deal with it in a proactive way. It won't go away. It won't get significantly better. It's unlikely. We will all be happy, but it's unlikely. If you continue to deal with it reactively, it not only limits your options, it also destroys the confidence of your leadership team and of the firm. You will end up feeling like a pinball that is being kicked around, that is just not a good option, because it doesn't make anything easier in a very challenging environment.
Yeah, I fully agree, Falco. And I think that the acknowledging that this is not going away and that you need to embrace it and understand it and therefore deal with it. And that, as I said, I will add my hopefully slightly positive message around that this is something that you can proactively manage. Then there's many things that can still be done there. So I think, Falco, we can continue to speak for hours about this, but we probably covered the most important messages. That much more is to be done, and that we don't think that this geopolitical uncertainty and environment is going to go away, certainly not in the short to medium term. So many things to be get going from a business perspective. Thank you, Falco, for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.